Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Thomas Greminger. He's the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He was the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He has been a distinguished diplomat. He is a prolific author. And he also has, believe it or not, a military background. He is the Lieutenant Colonel GS, Company and Battalion Commander of Infantry Unit of Swiss Armed Forces. So we are very much in the presence of a Renaissance man. Welcome, Thomas.
Welcome, Atul. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. So, Thomas, question for you straight off the bat. You've been a top Swiss diplomat. You've authored many books. And so you're the perfect person to answer this question. How does Switzerland see the world?
Well, look, comparatively speaking, Switzerland is doing quite well economically, politically. I think we came out of COVID relatively well. But clearly, if we look beyond our borders, we are also very worried by what we see, by these multiplying crises, wars. I think we were very shocked, to see again military action in the heart of Europe, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in February 2022. This, was something that marked also Swiss security policy thinking. Obviously, last October, the brutal terrorist attack on Israel and the ensuing war in Gaza with, this Israeli retaliation with a heavy toll on the civilian population, intolerable violations of international humanitarian law. All this is something that worries Swiss. I think we are also worried to see that military means have again become fashionable to resolve political problems. And I think there is this general concern when we look at the state of the world. If there is something positive that I would like to mention, then it would be the Swiss relations with the European Union. This, has been a big challenge for Switzerland for many years, that we are not part of the most important regional organization on our continent. At the same time, we are geographically in the heart of Europe, and we were a couple of years ago in a deep impasse in shaping our relations with the European Union. And right now, it seems that there is again a plan, a clearly defined process on how to move ahead and to shape these relations in a more predictable, constructive way. I would say that is the light at the end of the tunnel.
I see. Now, some say that violence did not necessarily begin with the Ukraine war. Some say the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 was utterly unjustified and it broke international law. And what we are seeing is a result of US distraction because of 20 years of war on terror, and also the US weakening of the multilateral rules-based order itself, because the US has walked out of Kyoto, walked out of Paris. And so gradually, bit by bit, other people have taken heed, and they are doing the same. Might is right is now the new norm.
I would, totally agree with your assessment, and clearly, I would be the first to confirm that the Russian invasion of Ukraine did not come out of the blue. There were, deep conflicts visible for quite some time, both between, let's say, Russia and Ukraine, but also between Russia and the West. And I think there were plenty of opportunities to address these conflicts in a non-violent way, and on both sides, I would insist. And these opportunities were not taken, unfortunately, which still, wouldn't, in my view, justify a military invasion of a sovereign country. But there were conflicts looming. There was obviously also, an arms control architecture that was created over many years that was slowly but surely unraveling. And we all saw it, but I think there was not enough political will to, stop that unraveling. And I think now we are paying the price for it. So in that sense, there was this term, die Zeitenwende, that was, created by the German Chancellor.
Olaf
and in a way,
in his
Olaf
great speech. Yeah,
exactly. And in a way, he's right. I think this war brought very profound changes to, how we perceive security in Europe, interstate relations in Europe. But at the same time, as I said, it did not come out of the blue. There were lots of indicators that things were getting worse and worse over the last, I would say, 15 years.
So Russia has slipped into authoritarianism. Some would say a new form of Tsarism. Glenn Carl, my co-author, retired from the CIA, and I wrote a long piece on the philosophers who drive Putin, and one of them was, of course, in Switzerland, Ilin. Whilst that is true, what I've heard in private from many Swiss and European diplomats is a great unease about U.S. foreign policy. One diplomat said that Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya led to a refugee crisis. Ukraine has caused economic strain. Now we have war in Gaza. My question to you is, how do these wars affect Europe? And what would Switzerland like to see?
Well, obviously, these wars have been affecting Europe, and in particular also Switzerland, quite heavily. In particular, of course, the repercussions of the war against Ukraine. This, had huge consequences in terms of energy security. Food security a bit less in Europe. Refugee flows. I mean, we have more than 50,000 Ukrainian refugees in Switzerland. So, obviously it impacted very much. Now, when it comes to U.S. policies, I think the perception was in particular critical, and I would say negative, of the Trump administration.
Absolutely.
And, this administration was perceived to be unpredictable, unreliable, and in that sense, there is also a lot of apprehension, I think, in Europe in general, regarding, the risk of a second term of Donald Trump. In that sense, I think we all were happy that the Biden administration brought back this, sense of partnership with Europe. And in that sense, if you look at, for instance, the stance on the war in Ukraine, I think there is an impressive Euro-Atlantic unity on it. And I think Switzerland is very much part, of that unity. When it comes to Gaza, there is a lot of solidarity, I think, in Europe, in Switzerland, with Israel. There is perhaps more of a sense here that, the Israeli response has been producing too much humanitarian suffering.
So it's disproportionate. That is the view you take from
absolutely.
Geneva.
Absolutely, which of course is not surprising because Geneva is the capital of international humanitarian law, and this is of course a very important perspective.
And you have the Geneva Convention named after Geneva.
Absolutely, and so we Swiss International Geneva obviously very much stand for IHL. But I would also say, this idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian issue, could simply be managed and would somehow, disappear over time. I think this is clearly not shared or not shared anymore. Here in Europe, in Switzerland, there is a sense, that this what's been happening since the 7th of October is, I think, a very strong wake-up call to proactively now address these more fundamental issues and to again try to seriously resolve the Palestinian issues instead of simply, managing it.
All right. You mentioned that Switzerland is now very much working in tandem with the US. And this is a question that comes from Roberta Campani, my colleague who's met you and who has great respect for you. And she says, historically, Switzerland has been neutral, and she's Swiss, based in Geneva. And neutrality is a strong part of Swiss identity. However, Switzerland has signed on to sanctions on Russia, not asked for a ceasefire in Gaza, and become more Atlanticist. Is Switzerland really neutral anymore? I know there's an internal debate on this.
Well, the short answer is yes. But let me elaborate a bit on it. I think, first of all, I would very much subscribe to the notion that neutrality is more than just a foreign policy instrument in Switzerland. It has become part of the Swiss identity. And I think this has to be factored in. Now,
so it's part of the cultural DNA.
In a way, absolutely. And, even though, the official narrative is clearly neutrality is a foreign policy instrument, full stop. But I think, to be honest, it's clearly much more. Now, second point, clearly, and I think I alluded to it before, the Russian war against Ukraine has affected Swiss neutrality policy thinking, clearly.
So this is Zeitenwende, not just for Germany, but for Switzerland.
Yeah, perhaps Zeitenwende is too much, implies too much drama. And I will explain. I mean, clearly, the Swiss will not abandon neutrality, and there was just a recent poll that showed that there are still way beyond 80% of the Swiss, believing and wanting to maintain neutrality. But I think you have to differentiate between the law of neutrality and neutrality policy. I think when it comes to the law of neutrality, obligations by international law of not supporting militarily any party to a conflict, not allowing parties to a conflict to use our territory. I think this, there is absolutely no doubt, this will remain at the core, is uncontested, will remain uncontested. When it comes to neutrality policy, again, I would argue there hasn't been really a fundamental change to the neutrality policy as defined by the Swiss government after the end of the Cold War. In 1993, there was a neutrality policy defined by the Swiss government that, for instance, would allow to accept sanctions either adopted by the United Nations or by the European Union. So in that sense, nobody should have been surprised by Switzerland, accepting the same set of sanctions against Russia after the invasion as the European Union did. Now, where I would see a change in Swiss neutrality policy is clearly when it comes to security cooperation with like-minded states and organizations. I think this is the novelty. And here you have in the supplementary report to the official Swiss security policy report, you have an explicit mandate to work more closely with like-minded, including like-minded institutions. And this obviously means NATO and the European Union. So Switzerland has now the challenge of intensifying security cooperation with these institutions without, of course, jeopardizing neutrality, without questioning, fundamentally neutrality. But there is, this sense that we need to work closer with those that share our values, that disagree with those that fundamentally violate international law.
So let's move on from Switzerland to Europe. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders has emerged on top. In Germany, the AfD is on the rise. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni is prime minister. So you talk about moving closer to like-minded countries, institutions, but the countries themselves don't seem to be as like-minded anymore. My question is simple. Is Europe turning to populist nationalism again?
There is, of course, a very worrisome trend in that direction. And and if you look at all of our neighbors, and you haven't referred to Austria.
No, I haven't referred to Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary. Slovakia has Robert Fico, Hungary has Viktor Orban.
Orban, exactly. Well, Austria, still has, what I would call a decent government, but yes, there are elections looming. And, what I hear from our recent neighbors is not very encouraging. So there is
Schaefer of the Institute of the Danube in Central Europe. I interviewed him yesterday, and he was very worried about the forthcoming elections in Austria, and he's in Vienna.
Yeah. No, that's also what I've been hearing lately. So there is clearly this populist trend, and I think that needs to be taken seriously. And by the way, we also have it in Switzerland. We may want to come back to that in a moment. And now the question is obviously, how can you counter this trend? And why is it, that populist movements all over the place are growing? And I think there are different factors. One is that there are people that have a sense that this kind of globalization that we've been seeing over the last 3 decades, that economic growth has benefited only a relatively small a group of people. So in a way, the rich have become richer while the broad masses of people have not really taken advantage of this, form of a globalized economy. I think that is a trigger. There is a sense of governments not taking seriously ordinary people, not listening hard enough, not being responsive to their concerns. But perhaps it has also partly to do with the current generation of political leaders. You have there has been a generation of leaders, that would have credibly opposed populists, and I see less and less of these political figures around. So I think it's a mix. But I mean, what is clear is that these simplest, nationalist, xenophobic attempts to respond to current challenges, both on the national and international level, they won't work. So I guess we all have an interest, to convince people that populism is not the answer.
So Switzerland is held as a model for that. Swiss democracy has been resilient and moderate. Many think it is the perfect country in the world, with cows in pastures and perfect trains through tunnels.
Sure.
So is Switzerland proving immune to the populist nationalist trend?
No, definitely not. I mean, the biggest political party in Switzerland, the Swiss People's Party, has a platform that has at least a lot of populist elements. And there are perhaps, in the Swiss governance system elements that mitigate or attenuate this populist drive. And, if I were to mention some of them, I think it's the federal structure of Switzerland, where democracy is very close to the people. It's this subsidiarity in the Swiss political system, where basically communes have a say over most relevant political issues, and then it's cantons, and at the end it's the central state, the federal authorities, and I think that is that gives people the feeling that they impact on how their commune, their canton, their country is gone. Perhaps it's also the direct democracy element, that helps. If you're really frustrated about a specific issue, well, then go and collect signatures and go for a referendum or launch an initiative. And you know, clearly there has been now a massive increase of initiatives that have been launched in recent times, and perhaps that's partly, you know, also a response. If you're frustrated with, let's say, your parliament, with your central government, then you have means to still kind of advance your political ideas. But having said that, you know, Switzerland is definitely not perfect. There are populist threats as well, and that need to be countered in Switzerland as elsewhere.
So this is another Roberta Campani question, who is in the same city as you, and she poses, what do you think about the relatively new Swiss law, Measures for Protection Against Terrorism, MPT as it is known? Do you think it weakens liberty and by extension democracy?
Well, this is a big debate in Switzerland. There was a big debate leading up to the adoption of the law. And it also triggered quite some amendments to the law. This is obviously the dilemma that you face when, on the one hand, you try to come up with a response to a security threat, a relevant security threat by, you know, violent extremists, by terrorists, and on the other, you don't want to undermine your free, your pluralistic society. Yes. You don't want to restrict civil liberties. My feeling, but this is perhaps because, you know, I'm a person that comes out of the security policy world, I think the law managed to find a balance between, you know, the two sets of interests. Yeah. Now we will have to see how the law is being implemented, and there are discussions, you know, as we speak, and we might then at some point come to the conclusion that we do have to amend, better protect liberties that are being undermined. But for the time being, I would say we managed to find a relatively good balance.
Yes, and to your point, I served as an officer in India as well, and I did counterinsurgency. And it is tricky for any democracy to find that balance between security and liberty, because one of the duties of the state is to make its citizens secure. And the greatest security is the security of life. And then perhaps you can argue property. You don't want things being blown up, especially public property. If someone blows up a train station or a post office, the taxpayer is left with the bill, even if there is no loss of life. And so that balance is really hard for any democracy, any liberal democracy, all the way, you know, from Norway and Sweden to Spain. And you could argue the US and India are not liberal democracies, and maybe they are not, but they are democracies. And even there, it's a tricky balance, and you can err either way very easily. So I take your point. Let's go back to foreign affairs now. And how does Switzerland view Asia, especially China?
Well, Switzerland has, an economy with an extremely strong international orientation, and so I think there was early on a huge interest for emerging markets in Asia. And in particular, I mean, there was, I would say, an euphoria for China in Switzerland. And I would say when it comes to emerging markets in Asia in general, there is still a huge interest, and you see a lot of Swiss engagement, including when it comes to foreign direct investments, when it comes to trade. Looking more specifically at China, I think relations have sobered up to a certain extent. I mean, there is still, of course, a lot of trade and investment, and there is still a sense within the Swiss private sector that you can make good money in China. But there is also a sense, that it is challenging, that the environment is often difficult. And then, of course, also politically, China has become much more assertive in many ways, internally, but also in its foreign policy. And I think this has affected also the way we perceive China and Swiss-Chinese relations. I think they're, not seen as romantically as they were for quite a while.
So in that sense, you are paralleling the Germans. The Germans were very dependent and still are very dependent on exports to China. And for a while, there was a real love affair. BASF has made huge investments in China. Other German companies have done the same. They have sent a lot of stuff, they've built a lot of the machines that have helped the Chinese build goods for the rest of the world. And of course, Chinese companies have been buying up German companies. So it wasn't just German investment going, there was a backflow. And now you have the German Foreign Ministry admitting that now they see China as a strategic competitor, because BYD, the electric car company, is the biggest car company in the world, and it seems electric cars are the future, and they'll be having the German car industry for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, unless the Germans can reinvent themselves. So now suddenly the Germans are not feeling so rosy about their romance. It seems the Swiss experience is paralleling the German one.
I think what is different to Switzerland is there is a bit less dependence, I think. But there are still, of course, strong economic interests.
If I may, what is the percentage of the GDP exports in Switzerland, and how much of that is going to China?
I would have to look it up. Sorry, I can't tell you.
No worries. I just was curious.
Yeah. But I would say, perhaps the competition is a bit less explicit as between Germany and China, and the dependence is perhaps also a bit less. But at the same time, there is. There are political realities. There is obviously also, the pressure that stems from the Sino-American relations, competition, rivalry. That is affecting. There is this, pressure to kind of take sides. So. It has become much more complicated when I compare with, let's say, 5-8 years ago.
Understood. So we've talked a bit about China. Let's talk about developing countries, or emerging markets, as you call them. Now, they are going through another crisis now. Latin American economies are in the doldrums. African countries are suffering coups, many of which are popular. Ironically, even Asian economies, with the exception of India, Vietnam, and a few others, are not growing that fast. Not even China is growing fast. It's going through deflation. So what lies ahead, and how does Switzerland plan to navigate this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, or VUCA world, as the Americans like to call it?
Yeah, we also, teach this VUCA terminology at the GCSB, so I'm familiar with that. Yeah,
I see.
Look, I think economically, the reasonable response would be diversify. Just make sure that you are not too dependent on a single market. And to the extent possible, this is obviously easier said than done. In particular, if you are an SME, then you cannot all of a sudden.
If you're a small company making mics which go to the rest of the world in Germany, or if you're a surgical instruments like Matthews in Switzerland, you're exporting all around the world. It's easier said than done.
Absolutely. And politically, I think, Switzerland, I think, will have to continue to contribute to solving global challenges, climate change, generally development challenges. Switzerland will continue to contribute to managing conflict, promoting peace and security. I think Switzerland has now, once it came out after the Cold War, has developed, a very active foreign policy that, engages in important areas, again, development, climate, peace and security. And I think this needs to be continued, strengthened, not least because it is also in our economic interests. At the same time, we are of course aware we are not agenda setters. It's not going to Switzerland on its own that is, going to solve global or regional problems or challenges. But I think Switzerland can contribute and is expected to contribute because we also take advantage, of this globalized world, and so I think there is an obvious interest, but also an expectation that Switzerland contributes.
So you just mentioned, I'll have a follow-up question on this. You just mentioned a few priorities for Switzerland. From where you sit, the vantage point in Geneva, and of course Switzerland has extraordinary social capital in the world. You have Davos, you have Geneva as a center of so many international institutions. You have a reputation for being professional and courteous and efficient. So from your vantage point, what would be the top 3 priorities of all the ones you mentioned?
I think it depends a bit, what kind of actor you are. When I, now as the executive director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, I have, of course, I think I have a few comparative advantages to offer. They're linked, I think, to our Swissness. They're linked to the fact that we are part of international Geneva, and that very much centers around us being able to bring all relevant actors to a table for dialogue, for negotiations. So I think one of the things that I offer is
convening power. the convening power that you have in Geneva.
Absolutely. And I think where I would insist, also bringing non-like-minded people together. We live in a world composed of echo chambers where, people that don't share others' views have stopped talking to others. And I think here we can offer a safe space to bring non-like-minded people together. I mean, to give you a few examples, I think we offer probably the last platform where American and Russian experts and officials talk about nuclear arms. We have a platform where all relevant stakeholders that are interested in the Arctic come to the same table to discuss matters, governance, research, military aspects of the Arctic. So I think that's a huge asset that we can bring to bear. And I think that is we have massively expanded over the last 2 years our portfolio of informal dialogue platforms because there is a demand to talk in a very polarized world.
Well, Thomas Greminger, thank you so much. Fair Observer publishes perspectives from non-like-minded people too. We are trying to fight the filter bubbles and echo chambers of today, which have been exacerbated by social media. So we salute what you do, and we hope to have you back for another discussion very shortly. Thank you very, very, very much for your time and a wonderful discussion.
You're most welcome, and I'm very grateful for your interest. Thank you, Abdul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.